Well, hello there, friends from the internet. This is Scott with Crescent Soil Services, and this is Science Bro, where we live stream. What do we live stream here? We live stream functional strategies for success in the commercial cannabis markets. And thanks for picking up your phone and joining to the show. We haven't been super active here on this channel because we've been very busy. We have been teaching a lot of master classes, and we've been getting back on the road working with commercial farms. And what I wanted to cover today was the concept of yield in commercial cannabis. So today's show is going to be one in several series where we talk about the factors for yield. And that's one of the most common things that people ask us is, how do I improve my yield? And there's a lot of things that are going on right now in this current era of cannabis that absolutely reduce yield at every step of the way. So what we're going to try and do here is introduce concepts that will help you regain that yield that you're losing through poor techniques or poor understanding of the techniques that lead to commercial yields, basically. If you're following along on the live stream, go ahead and drop your questions in the chat, and I'll circle back around to the question and answer. If you're watching this show at a later date, drop your questions into the comments, and I'll circle back around and answer you in the comments. So, with regards to cannabis production, or really any crop for that matter, a lot of your yield is determined in the nursery stage. And so my wife Sarah and I have been professionally consulting with large-scale cannabis farms since the start of cannabis legalization in the United States. We've now worked with farms in every single state and something like 6 countries. So we've got a lot of experience with regulated cannabis. The reason that's important is in regulated cannabis, you are required to take track and trace data. So track and trace data is what the regulated farms are required to do. And in agriculture, they call this the harvest index. So the harvest index is when, say you're growing corn and you have to weigh the leaves and the stalks and then the part that you sell, which is the corn. And that relationship between the part that you don't sell and the part that you do sell is called the harvest index. And so cannabis is required to keep these metrics. So every time that you prune, that leaf biomass is weighed and then entered into the metric system and kept along with track and trace. So how that comes into play is, as a consultant with these farms, the farms that are at the top of the industry, undeniably one of the most common things that all of those top farms has is they take this track and trace data and turn it into learning. So we have had a lot of opportunities to analyze that data, and we get very clear understandings of what reduces yield and what increases yield. Undeniably, one of the biggest bottlenecks is in moms and prop. So when legalization started, it allowed cannabis growers to go to previously unheard of size and scale and scope. And pretty much every cannabis farmer can flower all of the clones that they have, but very few farmers, even now, after 10 years in regulation, have a hard time producing enough healthy starts to then flower in the flowering room. So one of the biggest bottlenecks is always in moms and prop. So I've spent a tremendous amount of time analyzing moms and prop and looking for the opportunities for increases of yield, and in those situations of the behavior that was decreasing yield. It's undeniable that if mom health is poor, clone health is going to be poor. If clone health is poor, you're going to have poor rooting. If you have poor rooting, you're going to have clones staying in those trays much longer than they should, which further reduces yield. So every step of the way, you're reducing yield with poor cloning, poor mom health. And so I'm a big advocate of really properly providing the nutrition needed to the mother stock, foliar feeding quite regularly to make sure that that above ground biomass that you're going to be cutting off is as full of nutrients as possible. And so the strategy that we take is what's called a full fertility approach. So we're not, what's up, Loy? We're not, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's cool to see Loy. He's way out there in the international scene somewhere. So I'm a big fan of full fertility nutrition, which full fertility nutrition means that we are paying attention to the relationship between nitrogen and calcium, calcium and magnesium, calcium and potassium, potassium and phosphorus, right? And then all the boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, sometimes cobalt, molybdenum, and selenium. The important part to take away is we are paying attention to all the major and minor elements when we are fertilizing. Now, I realize for a lot of the home growers that's hard to do. We have access to a lot of testing, and through that testing, we've learned understandings of what leads to good nutrition in all plants, and especially in the moms and prop. And then we associated that with plant sap data to confirm that. So we're looking at soil chemistry, water chemistry and fertilization, foliar feeding, and then checking and balancing all that with plant sap nutrition. So in that process, it was essential, it appeared to, the data shows that it's essential to pay attention to those major and minor elements. So for the smaller grows, that's really difficult to do without all the testing. So one of the businesses that we have sells products to our clients and masterclass students. That's called CGG Distro. I'll put a link in the chat. I didn't think about it before the show, but I'll go back and put it in. But one of the things we're doing now is we're testing the raw inputs. So the Organics Alive powders, the CalMags we use, all that stuff. We're doing analysis of that so we know exactly what's in it. And then if you send your water test to us, I will build a custom feed that hits all these targets for your water. That's something that we're starting to do this year. And we've been piloting it with masterclass students and clients, and it's going really well. So that's one thing that you can start with, is just proper nutrition. It's going to be very difficult to have peak production and yield if you don't understand what goes into the nutrition of the plant and ultimately what goes into the nutrition of moms. So basically, some of the simple things that I do is, foliar feed those mothers with balanced nutrition, and making sure that the shoots and growth tips that you're going to be cutting off have the mineral nutrients that they need in order to then root properly. So that's a big first step. Where it starts to degrade for most people is in the cloning process. So in clones, most people are aware that they will root at different rates. There's a lot of disagreement on which ones root faster and root slower, but undeniably, tops, lowers, and inners are all going to root at different stages. If you're taking all those tops, moms, and inners and putting them into the same clone tray, you are going to have clones that root faster, that are ready faster, and then are held too long in those clone trays. On the other side of the spectrum, you're going to have clones that don't root fast enough, and they're not going to be in the clone trays long enough, and they're going to be removed too soon with a not a substantial enough root system. Just this one dynamic of having clones in the tray for too long, pulling clones out of the tray too soon, that's like 8 to 12% of your yield potential, just that one thing right there. So if you get your cloning straight just from a timing of root production, you're going to likely find another 10 to 20% in yield just by getting those clones into peak flow, I guess I would say. So you don't want to be holding up the ones that are rooting faster, and you don't want to be rushing through the ones that are rooting slower. I realize for the smaller scale farmers, it's difficult to have enough clones to separate them into different trays. But at the commercial scale, we absolutely try to encourage farms to separate tops from the lowers and the inners and let them root at their own speed. And then the day that those clones are ready, take them into the next stage and move into transplanting. Another thing that happens is just poor rooting. So the longer the clones are in the trays, the more nutrient deficient they're going to become, and the harder they're going to have a time getting out of that hole and ultimately producing peak potential. So understanding the conditions for clones, which I'm not going to go in today, but the general concept is moisture management is key. I like to weigh the trays. So we soak the cubes, weigh them to set them to a very specific start point, and then you plug all your clones, and then 2 days later we start adding moisture to that tray to put it back to that same exact starting point. We like to swap out the domes each day for dry domes. I see some people like to miss the domes. I'm not a fan of that. If that works for you, that's great. I always go dry domes, and I swap them out in the morning. So overnight that clone tray is going to mist up and get foggy. In the morning, you come in, put on a clean, dry dome, get the wet one over the sink, rinse it out, and let it dry, and have 2 sets of domes and rotate them. Now, if you're adding moisture back to the bottom, that works great. And basically, you're facilitating transpiration, and by facilitating transpiration, you are going to facilitate nutrient movement, which is going to create rooting. So I'm a big fan of that, is managing moisture. So figure out that set point for the clones, the trays, the liners, the cubes, the liner, and the tray. For general Rockwool cubes, 50 to a tray, it usually turns out somewhere around 2 kilograms. Some of the lighter, like iHort cubes, you might be more like 1.6 kgs to start out. And I like to put it back to that same set point. And basically what you're doing is, by weighing a wet set of cubes in a tray that has a certain weight, and then when you put clones in it, that adds weight to it. So basically, by weighing before you put the clones into that tray, you're baking in a minor reduction of moisture, which is what starts the rooting process. And then every day setting it back to that same set point, putting on a dry dome, that's my preferred favorite strategy. But separating them is huge. There's a lot of yield potential lost by having mixed trays, rooting at different rates, and ultimately going into that. And then moving into the next stage, you need to have good, vigorous rooting. So in order to do that, you have to understand moisture management, which in the living soil world is pretty lacking. And a lot of these biochar-based soils, heavy peat moss, you're just going to get slow growth rates. So I'm not a fan of biochar. I don't believe in it. All it does is allows you to overwater your soil, which slows down growth. So I'm a big fan of using more coco coir-based potting soils that allows air into the root zone, allows you to water them, and allows that moisture to move through the root zone so you're not just sitting in a waterlogged pot. So having waterlogged clones is going to further slow down root growth, slow down establishment, which is ultimately going to slow down your transplant success. So in order to have successful streamline transplanting that leads to prolific growth, you have got to build a substantial root zone in that vegetative space in a short amount of time, because you don't really want those clones in those 2 gallons for 6 or 8 weeks. You really want to get that wrapped up in like 3.5 weeks. And when you incorporate biology, you have proper nutrition, you're using the proper soil, it's absolutely possible to get a clone to an 18-inch tall teen with structure in 3 to 3.5 weeks. And keeping them longer further starts to retard their growth. So, this is the part that I don't fully understand, but I observe. Some people talk about in agriculture how a plant has some sort of signals where when it's starting its early stage of life, it kind of assesses the environment around it and what the potential of that environment is. Part of that is its rooting container. Starting out those plants in a very small pot is absolutely going to hinder yield. We've worked with a lot of commercial farms that come from hydro and move into living soil, and they want to use these little like 4-inch by 4-inch pots. That shit is garbage. Like that is the number one reducer of yield, is taking your clones and put them to a little tiny pot. And basically what I've observed happens is farmers have a hard time hitting yield, and they always want to solve the problem with plant counts. And in living soil, the more plants you go to, the lower your yield's going to be. That's just the way it works out. You need a big pot, and you want to put those clones into the largest pot that you can. I prefer the 7x7 pots. So, we've worked closely with Grassroots to design the living soil lined beds. And then now in the past couple of years, I've worked with Rain Science to create their version of the lined beds. And so in all of our, not all of our, but most of our consulting clients, we use the 7x7 Rain Science bottomless pots. And I personally believe that is undeniably the best pot in that smaller container. And basically what that pot has, it's got a fabric liner on the inside that traps in the moisture but allows the air to leave. So they're very forgiving. They're very hospitable to biology, and we just get really good growth rates in them. And then moving those bottomless pots into flowering, if you understand how to use those and you understand how to create a vigorous root system, well, they work great. On the farms that have a hard time figuring out how to get a prolific root system, well, then if you just set that pot on top of the soil and you don't have enough roots down at the bottom, well, you're not going to have very good transplant success. So a lot of times people switch to the bottomless pots and they haven't understood how to build a big root zone, especially one that goes down to the bottom of the pot. And now you're going to have poor transplant success. So, figure that part out first before you start to do the transplant. But there's a significant aspect of the cloning process that leads to yield. High plant counts in living soil, I'm never going to subscribe to that. We've seen a lot of people do 1 plant per square foot. That's the lowest producing yields in all of living soil, in my opinion. And then when we work with a farm that starts out with like 16 to 20 plants and we start reducing down, every time they reduce plant count, yields go up. So I realize that's a hard leap for people to make. If you're struggling to produce yield, it's counterintuitive to think reducing plant counts will do that, but it always does in my experience, as long as you've got some of those other things squared away. So you can't just put less plants and not take care of them. So you have to fertilize appropriately. You have to have decent soil chemistry and balance. And then incorporating the biology is always going to give you the greatest benefit for sure. So kind of the moms and prop stop, there's a lot of yield potential lost in the process from taking a clone from a mother, rooting it poorly or well, and then moving that into a root zone or into a small pot, building a successful root zone so that you can have a good transplant and restart that process. It's incredibly stressful and energy intensive for a plant to be moved and moved and moved and moved. And if you can build up a good substantial root zone and a healthy plant, then you're going to have much better transplant success. So, Justin's making a great point here. This is something I say a lot here too, is reducing plant counts also reduce stress on moms and props. So the higher you go with plant counts, the more you're stressing moms. The more you stress moms, the less yield they are. So managing that balance between plant count and productivity is really important. But the farms that we see really try to go for high plant counts ultimately stress their moms. You start to get lower rooting percentage, so you take more clones. It's more stress on the moms. They don't recover. You start taking less, smaller, less good, if you can say that, clones, and it just starts to become a hamster wheel of death that's hard to overcome. So you got to give those moms a chance to recover. You have to reduce your plant counts in order to get good, healthy clones, and then understand how to get them through propagation quickly and with the nutrition that they need. Coming out of moms and prop is going to be the start of canopy management. So I'm going to jump over here to my overhead projector, and we're going to do some little drawing here. So one of the things that I see a lot is poor management of canopy. And so if you've got a clone in a 1 gallon pot, and it's going to have basically a top node and maybe one more node, and you got to try to turn that into a plant with substantial canopy. What I prefer to do is when this hits 12 inches, we're going to do a micro top of the first highest most node. What's that going to do? That's going to cause things to sprout. It's going to cause this one to kind of come up, and then once this new main top, sorry for my drawing, it's not going to be that fancy, but you get the idea. Once that top gets up to 14 inches again, we're going to micro top that again, which is going to cause them to go. By that point, you probably have a few other branches coming up, and at this point, you're going to want to micro top those as well, and those are going to split. I'm not worried about having a perfectly flat canopy. I'm worried about creating structure that ultimately will produce colas. And so again, once here at about 16 inches now, right here about 16 inches, we're going to top everything again. So we're going to micro top. We're not hard topping. We're not removing a substantial amount of plant growth. We are literally just pinching off the apical meristem. In the internet, they call it fimming. In the commercial space, you get laughed at. You call it fimming, so we call it micro topping. And so we're micro topping to create main growth shoots that will ultimately, ran out of space here, that will ultimately hold colas, right? And so we need to produce structure and branching that will ultimately become colas. And too much focus on making a flat canopy at the beginning is going to be problematic. And so these are really important numbers. What I like to do is I like to get a bamboo stake, and at the 12-inch mark, put a tape line. At a 14-inch mark, put a tape line. Put another tape line at 16. You probably make it easier if you take this to 18 inches. And then you just put a tape line. And basically what's going to happen is these clones are all going to hit 12 inches at a different day. And so what I do is I put my little bamboo stake in the top of the pot. This is starting to get a crowded drawing. And where that tapering is, whenever the plant gets, whatever day that clone hits 12 inches, we're going to start that micro-topping. And it might take you 2 to 4 days to go through your populations, but what's going to be important is this elevation. I think this is something that's completely lost on most cannabis farmers, is how the elevation with which you start your canopy management starts to affect overall growth. And so how that plays out into the flowering space is if we've got our bed here and we're trying to put rows of plants, I prefer 2 rows of plants in that, bed. So we've got our clones here, and what becomes really important is if this clone was managed properly, the way I was just telling you, and it starts its first forking at 12 inches, starts its second forking at 14 inches, and then we do it again here at like 16 to 18 inches. We've got these elevation points where everything in that bed is starting its branching at the same elevation. I hope that makes sense. And so what you want to try and accomplish is have all the plants in this bed having their structure happening at the same elevation. So if we got another plant that was like spindly and we topped it too early and we started that branching down here, got out of sync with our other plants, ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to have a huge disparity between cola formation. I guess this isn't a very good drawing, I apologize. But basically what will happen is if you top all your clones at the same height, they're going to have the same structure of cola development under that trellis. So if this plant was topped maybe when it was taller or whatever, maybe you're going to have smaller potential for colas. And what it comes down to on the track and trace data is if you take all these populations of clones and they were topped at all different kinds of heights, you're going to have different potential for colas. And you want everything under this trellis to have the same potential for cola. And so you might have an even top canopy, but when you look down, like this one's got 9 inches of cola and this one's got 4 inches of cola. That is a substantial factor for yield and producing the yield. You want all of them to have the same potential for cola development at the same duration. This is, in my opinion, much more important than just having a flat canopy. So I realize this is kind of a crummy drawing, but I hope you got the vibe from that. I hope you got the idea of what we're talking about there. So canopy management and making sure that you have your elevation set. And it's really hard to tell when you walk into a room or a greenhouse to look. It may look full, it may look dense. You might have created the most perfect canopy with little tops coming out at the same point. But when you start to take per plant yields, there's substantial difference from plant to plant. And one of the biggest factors is what height was that plant when you started the topping process. So a lot of times, and we see this a lot in like the tent growers and the home growers, they start to get good at LST, they start to get good at topping to direct growth into a flat canopy, and then they have really low yields. So flat canopy is part of it, but if you've not allowed that plant to create elevation for colas, it's not going to produce a yield. Oftentimes we see people that do a lot of LST, which would be clear is my least favorite canopy management strategy. Very few people understand how to do that effectively to produce yield. And ultimately what they do is they create lower producing offshoots and a very short, shallow canopy. So if you've got a really, you may have a really flat canopy, but if you've only got 4 inches of cola potential, you're not going to get the yield. So that's one of the most important things for canopy management. And here's a question I'm gonna go ahead and jump to because this is a good point. So do we have any data on untopped plants? Yeah, absolutely. And you can't avoid canopy management. You have to participate in the process because ultimately if that plant was left to its own, it'd grow like a Christmas tree, right? It would grow very bottom heavy and it would make some colas, but ultimately it would grow very bottom heavy. And we're trying to get a plant that looks like this, right? That has more cola density up top. Now, the problem with what we're trying to do and what the plant wants to do is what the plant wants to do with plant sap. Well, that's going to be a little bit hard to draw. But basically, what the plant wants to do and why it wants to grow like a Christmas tree is plants bring nutrients into their leaves, and then ultimately some of those minerals get moved as the plant grows. So there's a difference between mobile and immobile nutrients. So immobile nutrients would be like calcium. It gets brought into the plant and it stays there. Mobile nutrients will come into the lower leaves and then move up with the plant. And so the reason why the plant is trying to shape like a Christmas tree is so it can load up those lower leaves with a tremendous amount of mineral to then complete its life cycle. And most of what we do disrupts that. One of the most interesting things we've learned from the availability of doing plant sap data is, in plant sap, there's different ranges. There's deficiency, which is obviously not enough. There's sufficiency, which means just enough. And then there's surplus. Very rarely do we find commercial cannabis crops in that surplus range. It's always in deficiency, trying to get to sufficiency. And the plant is trying to bank minerals in those leaf materials. And as we keep plucking them off, we're disrupting that process, ultimately lowering yield. I see it all the time where farms literally prune off yield with the obsessive compulsive desire to remove leaf material. If you are not managing fertility, you're just literally pruning off yield. Now, you can't let it go completely unchecked. You can't just untop the plant because ultimately the plant doesn't have the same desire as you. The plant isn't necessarily going for peak flower production. The plant is going to just try to complete its reproductive cycle. And that's a little bit different than our goals. Now, the cool part about cannabis and tomatoes and other crops like that, you can manage them in a way that will produce more yield. So you do have to proactively interact with the plant in order to steer it into what would be its most productive configuration. So I really do believe that, yes, some topping needs to be done. If you don't do topping, you're not going to get enough cola potential. And basically, what I was trying to describe with topping them at 12, topping them again at 14, then topping all again at 16, you end up with, somewhere between 8 and 12 main growth shoots that can then produce cola. And those main growth shoots will actually stack colas. So if you start doing LST, you're producing side branches, which are not going to produce colas. They're going to produce little nug bobs. And it may look cool and it may be flat and it may look like you have a ton of colas, but the yield's actually quite low. So LST is kind of my least favorite strategy, which comes into my next part, which is timing of when you induce stress onto a plant. So when you talk about topping techniques, undeniably the worst would be like a mainline or a hard top. That's kind of like an internet forum home grower kind of thing. I've worked with probably 400 different commercial cultivators at this point. Not a single one of them does a mainline hard top. And so a mainline hard top is you're going to be cutting the center, biggest section of that plant to leave the lower branches, and ultimately you think that that becomes colas. And if you struggle with canopy management, sure, that's an easier way to get like colas, but that is undeniably the most destructive canopy management technique you could ever dream of doing. And when we take on a kind of a smaller level client or student and get them to stop doing that, usually the yield doubles. That is catastrophic to yield production and how long it takes for that plant to recover. So if you think about what I was talking about is the plant wants to bring minerals into the lower leaves and move them up into the uppers, and you just cut the upper, like you just took all the air out of your tires before a road trip. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to go anywhere, and you're going to get piss poor fuel mileage. So it probably takes 1 to 2 months for a plant to recover from that level of stress in order to get back to its peak production. So mainline hard topping is kind of the last thing that you want to do. Next most devastating is LST, which it says low stress training, but for those of us in the commercial space, a lot of us got to this point by setting up structured trials to answer questions of productivity in order to improve productivity. So that's another personality trait of all those people at the top 1% of 1% of all cannabis growers. They all set up small controlled trials to make one small change, to measure that effect, to determine if they're going to implement that to the whole room. That's undeniable across all the top tier guys and gals. And in that process, we have tested yield production potential of different canopy management techniques. In my experience, if you go and you pinch a branch to LST, yeah, it may cause offshoot, but it's going to take 2 to 3 weeks for that plant to recover from that topping technique in order to meet its peak productive potential. So sure, you can very easily induce side branching and make beautiful shaped plants. But if you're doing LST leading up to when you change to 12-12, you're chopping yield right off because of how stressful that actually is to the plant. You're damaging tissue. You're cutting off the flow of this natural movement of sap. So yeah, you create side branching, but you did it by cutting its head off. So LST is my least favorite. We don't do that in any of our commercial work. I do have friends that are proficient at it, that are good at it, but they also understand that LST has to stop 2 to 3 weeks before you initiate flower. So the reason why it doesn't really fit into the commercial space is there's not that much time. So you don't have time. In an outdoor crop, you can do it because you've got lots of time. But in an indoor crop, we're taking a rooted clone, putting it into a 7x7 pot for 3.5 weeks. It doesn't even have anything to LST at that point. And then you're going to move it into the flowering room. You got to give it 14 days in the soil-based systems to root in. And there's just no time. There's no time to induce that amount of stress, have the time to recover from it, and then get to the ultimate yield. So LST, a lot of times what we see, you see like beautiful flat canopies. You get lots of little nugs popping up, but they're all side branch lollipops. They're not cold loves. You need to create length of branches that has the potential to stack in order to create yield. And in order to do that, you need to create main growth shoots, right? So that's kind of the 20-cent tour of canopy management. I prefer, like I said, the micro topping. It only takes 2 to 3 days for plants to recover from that. So that technique can be done all the way up until 2 to 3 days before initiating flower with no measurable reduction in yield potential. So that's kind of a really big thing. Now, as far as non-canopy management related strategies is one of the questions we get asked most often now is with regards to crop steering. And anytime something becomes popular in hydroponics, there's people in living soil that try to insert that technique into living soil and talk about the hot topic. Disregard all of that. It's nonsense. Hydroponics is not living soil. They're not the same. They're almost mutually exclusive in most of the respects. If you look at what produces peak potential in hydroponics, oftentimes that's the most antagonistic thing you can do in living soil. And so one of the failed premises that people try to do is they try to take what's successful and popular and hot in hydroponics and try to insert it into living soils, and it almost never works out. So in living soil, it requires different canopy management and pruning techniques. It requires different environmental parameters, like VPD in living soil is complete nonsense. The last thing that you want to do in a living soil system indoors is run humidity higher than 60%. So don't fall into the trap of following what hydroponics do, but instead do what we did, was ask the question, what is this technique in hydroponics providing for the plant that brings about peak potential, and how do I find that in living soil, right? So a lot of people want to talk about crop steering, and it's nonsense in living soil. No disrespect, but ignore everybody that's talking about it. What you want to do is have functional, whoops, that was a bad start. We're going to start over. What you want to have is functional management of moisture. So basically what crop steering is doing is it's the conversation in hydroponics of properly managing the moisture in your substrate for peak performance. So we're going to call this wet up here. We're going to call this dry down here. And somewhere in the middle in living soil is ideal. And when I say ideal, we're talking about ideal for the organisms, which is what's going to produce the growth. So an important thing to understand about living soil is if you're not incorporating biology, you're missing most of the conversation. In order to incorporate biology, you have to think about how animals live and breathe. So these organisms are animals. They have a certain amount of air that they need and oxygen. They have a certain amount of moisture where they perform their functions. And when you are outside of those parameters, those organisms go dormant in order to protect themselves. So if you want to find peak performance and growth rates in a living soil system, you must manage moisture to what creates the highest productivity from biology. And that's what this looks like. So what we've got is a basic scale of wet to dry and time here. So if you're hand watering, you're going to come in and let's do the most exaggerated. So let's say you're a person that believes wet dry cycles are important in living soil, and you're going to start out dry. You're going to water to full runoff. You're going to let it dry back. You're going to water to runoff. You're going to let it dry back. You're going to water to runoff, right? But right here is the peak production range for biology. So every time you're up here, slow growth. Every time you're down here, slow growth. It's because you're literally putting organisms to sleep through excessive moisture, and then down here they're dry and they're just going to protect. So they're only functioning between this range in that system, and you're spending half of that time outside of it. Additionally, in living soil, this is also powdery mildew, and down here is mites. So when you are in living soil, when you're in the saturated side, you're producing powdery mildew. When you're on the drier side, you're producing mites, right? If you're not watering to runoff, but you're still hand watering, you're going to have less exaggerated wet dry cycles, and it's going to start to look like that. And so same thing, you're creating PM, you're creating mites down here. What you want to do is have a much more steady supply of moisture that spends the most hours of the day in this ideal range, which is what produces the peak potential. This whole like crop steering, wet dry cycles, like complete nonsense. Keep that in hydroponics. Don't mess with it in living soil. And so that's hard for people to hear, but that's the reality of it. And which comes back to this question, do you all use blue mats? Yes, I do. I've been installing blue mats since 2014. We've installed them in large commercial facilities. We put them in small facilities. The problem with blue mats is most people don't understand how the system works, and you have to leave it alone. Most people want to tinker. The more you turn it up, the more you turn it down, the more you flood. So blue mats get a really bad rep for people flooding their rooms, but it's literally the tendencies of cannabis growers that make them flood. So they can be really reliable. When we have had side-by-side comparisons of yield as measured by track and trace, not the international weed guy scale, but actual state documented, calibrated scales, yield production, we've seen roughly about a 20% increase in yield when the blue mats was the only thing that was changed. And that is the difference between keeping a consistent, steady moisture that ultimately keeps biology into its highest growth rates potential. So when you look at hydroponics, the reason why crop steering is such a hot topic right now is because for the first time widespread, cannabis growers have the ability to manage the moisture in their substrate. Just simply managing the moisture in your substrate is going to get increased performance in hydroponics. The reason why it's so popular right now is in hydroponics and rock wool specifically, if you're not able to specifically control the moisture in that substrate, it's going to make your water chemistry more unstable. So ultimately what has happened through the time in the United States is cannabis growers growing hydroponically that didn't have access to volumetric water content meters were just winging it or doing the squeeze test. The more dysfunctional that moisture management is, the more unstable water chemistry becomes in the root zone. And so ultimately what that led to was high nitrogen, high potassium, and high phosphorus, which under poor watering conditions will bring about more stability. So with the addition of volumetric water content meters widespread and the ability to control them using things like TrollMaster, Arroyo, GrowLink, all that stuff, allows you to very strategically manage moisture. Once you can actually manage and control moisture, that allows you to run higher levels of calcium, because it's the relationship between calcium and potassium in that water chemistry that determines substrate hospitality. And the more calcium you get, the more it impacts potassium uptake. So the more waterlogged that cube is, or the more dry it is, or both, you get better performance with higher potassium and lower calcium. So one of the reasons why crop steering is so popular right now is it allows you to manage moisture for peak potential in that system. And then it also allows you to run higher levels of calcium, which ultimately improves yield. So in living soil, this concept of like wetter and drier is a kind of a flawed concept. What you really should be focusing on to match the growth rates and the potential that comes from crop steering in hydroponics is doing what will allow peak potential from the biological system. So when it's too dry, the biological system goes dormant to protect itself from drought. If it's too wet, it goes dormant and protects itself from drought. And so basically you want to keep within that dead band, as we would call it. You want to keep within that dead band that keeps biology producing for the most hours through the growth cycle. So if you think of a standard growth cycle being, 80 days, and you're watering to full saturation and full dryback, you might be in the range of peak potential for 20 days, And so there's a whole bunch of days when those plants are just sitting in dirt waiting for nutrients to be produced. But if you tighten up that dead band and stop watering to runoff and stop letting full dry cycles, then you're going to have more hours of more days where biology is working on your behalf. And that is how you get peak potential in living soils, by supporting high, vigorous biological activity in the soil. I think I had one more picture, but I can't. Oh, yeah, I got one more picture here. So let me do one more. Let me take a sip of my tea, and we'll get to the projector here. So let's just think really granular about what produces potential in living soil system, because it's a very dynamic system. There's a lot of moving parts. Undeniably, the biggest effect on yield is the soil itself. The soil and the balance of the chemistry in that soil. So the more minerals we have in the soil, the more balanced it is, the bigger the bottom of our catapult. So we're building the catapult. I forgot to tell you that. So in order to have a catapult, you need a substantial base. And then you need the little flinger arm to shoot your rock, right? So the little flinger arm is fertilization. Is your fertilization. The fertilization is the arm. And in order to launch a rock a long distance, we need a big substantial base, we need a long arm, and then we need a fast launch. So the speed with which this catapult launches a rock is coming from the biological system, right? So it's all three of these things. You need adequate minerals in appropriate balance. You need soluble fertility that provides day-to-day nutrition. And then the speed of growth is going to come from the biology. So it takes all these things coming into line, which is kind of the silliness of like people want to get in the camp of like biology only or mineral chemistry only or water only. And like none of those individual things bring about peak performance. The only thing that brings about peak performance is putting all the components in the system into their correct order. So we got to get soil chemistry right. We need some means to providing soluble fertility, which partly comes from the biology. And then we're going to get, fast growth rates coming from the biology. So I hope that helps. We've been pretty busy, so I haven't been doing a lot of live streams lately. We've been doing our master classes. So yesterday was the last class in our first soil balancing session for this year. We did start a new deal. We're making a discount. A lot of people are taking all three classes. So we now have a trio discount. The next soil balancing class is going to start Friday, April 12th. So the next soil balancing session, which is 8 sessions long, is going to start April 12th on a Friday. The Crescent Method basic training is basically a simplified version of what we teach our consulting clients to help smaller growers and those of us that are on a budget, is this Crescent Method. So that's going on right now, but will end in a couple weeks. The next CMBT will start on Thursday, April 11th. And we do have a discount now, and we got a couple payment plans. We realize that everybody is on a budget right now, so we are sympathetic to that. Pretty much everybody is strapped. We get that. And so we're just trying to help you get access to the information that you need to be as successful as you need to be. And we're going basically back to back this year. So I'm doing 4 soil balancing classes back to back to back with a 2-week break. So the soil balancing master class is 8 weeks long. And in that class, you get access to a calculator tool to do the math, a set of videos to figure it out. And then we meet for 8 sessions on Fridays at 3 p.m. Mountain Time for about 3 hours. Last night we went about 4 hours long. But it's a lot of content. It's a lot of hours. And then if you join any masterclass session, you can continue joining. So that's a new change we made this year, is that if you take the first soil balancing masterclass, you can join any sessions of future masterclasses of soil balancing until your heart's content. And a lot of people are really liking that. It's a lot of information. It takes a long time to get it into your brain. And it's also starting to really build community, which is what we're really after, is a support system so you can be successful in a changing climate and a changing times. So, we really want to make sure that as many people are as successful as possible with that. So, I'm not sure if I missed any questions. Let me just scroll back real quick to see. Do we use epifluorescent lighting? So we do own an epifluorescent microscope. We don't really use it though. It's kind of intimidating to set it up. I've honestly never set it up. It was gifted to us by the ECI farm when they closed down. If we're interested in looking at, so the only purpose I would have for an epifluorescent microscope is to look at the successful colonization of mycorrhizal spores, but you can do that with just a UV light on a normal microscope. So I don't bother with the epifluorescent microscope. And I think I answered this one. Yes, we do use blue mats. Biochar. No disrespect to the biochar lovers, but it's all nonsense in my opinion. So this is kind of an interesting statement. I'd actually disagree with this. So soil-grown plants can absolutely have fantastic roots. I'll pull up some pictures for the next one, but I don't know. We get fantastic roots. The main thing with having successful rooting and living soil is having oxygen in the root zone. Most people are waterlogging the pots in too dense of a soil, and all of that is antagonistic to root systems. So that's why I like a soil with a little bit more cocoa core in it. But if you're incorporating biology, we get fantastic roots that absolutely rival hydroponic growth rates. So, yeah. So I think we got to the end there. I don't know if anybody has any last questions. But yeah, I apologize. We haven't been on here very long. It's been pretty busy. We've been doing a lot of master classes this year. We're starting to get back on the road for consulting, and that's that time of year. So, stay tuned. You know the deal. Like and subscribe, comment, helps the algorithm. Share it with a friend, that whole deal. Be back around. If you're listening to this after the live stream, go ahead and drop your questions, and then I'll try to keep this series going. There's a lot of factors for yield. I want to just kind of talk about the, what's up, Justin? Justin did just win. Justin just won 2 cannabis cups. He won the High Times and the Emerald Cup, first place. And he's a masterclass student that took the master classes and did it himself. So he took the soil balancing class, did his own mineral chemistry, took the CMBT, did a lot of his own work there. We still do the microscope work for him, but hopefully here soon he'll have the bandwidth to take that up. And going through that process, after about a year of incorporating and getting up to speed, he right away won 2 cannabis cups. Pretty big ones too. Emerald Cup's no slouch, and High Times Cup is no slouch. So system works, and that's what we're trying to do. I've lost count of how many commercial clients we've worked with that have won cannabis cups, but Justin is the first student to win a the first masterclass student to win a cannabis cup, which is a pretty big deal for us, because that's a big deal when you do it yourself. When we work with large farms and work together with them with all of our experience, it's pretty easy to win a cannabis cup. But as a student, learning these techniques, putting it to practice yourself, doing it yourself, and then winning a cannabis cup, that's pretty damn cool. So shout out to Justin at Stony Branch. and all the other masterclass students. I want to thank you all for joining. Check in next time and have a good Saturday.